pleasure to welcome everyone today. I'm delighted to do so. I have the pleasure of also introducing a very informative and exciting symposium for the publishing workshop. This is one of the highlights of the year. This is my third year sponsoring and having the opportunity to introduce the workshop for OVCR. This year, we're particularly proud to have teamed with the UI Press, as well as the UIC Institute for the Humanities as co-sponsors. And again, we're very proud to support publishing in the social sciences and humanities. As we all know, in research and scholarship area, publishing is critical, not only from the perspective of advancing one's academic career, but also from the perspective of contributing to the body of societal knowledge. The dissemination of significant scholarship not only enhances and extends the reputation of our university, it really promotes our thoughts, our creative contribution, and enhances and extends the reputation of the university, but also research and education to enrich the cultural and intellectual life, and the pride in our accomplishments to really enhance the global good. So again, we're all very proud to collaborate to present this year's sessions, Beyond the Monograph and New Directions in Marketing Academic Work. It should provoke and encourage each of us to write for and market to new audiences. Again, we're very proud to work with our collaborators in this event, UI Press today, as well as the Institute for Humanities. So I'm going to turn this back over to our moderator for today, Elena Gutiérrez, and she will oversee the remaining part of our meeting. So enjoy the presentations, ask many questions, and perhaps next year we'll have the pleasure of being together on site again, where we can really participate rather than only virtually today. So stay well, and Elena, it's off to you.
Thank you, Joanna, so much. And to all those at U of I Press and the Institute for Humanities who have made today's event possible. We appreciate all of your time and efforts so that we could share this moment together. I also want to give a big thank you in advance to our panelists today for sharing their experience and expertise, and to all of you who came, who are out there in Zoom land. We are glad that there are so many of you here. Please feel free to add any questions or comments you might have in the Q&A box, and we'll also monitor the chat box as well. We just have about a short 45 minutes, so I'm going to begin by quickly introducing myself and the panelists, and then we'll move on to discuss some questions that we've prepared, and we'll make sure that we have about 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. And I do want to remind folks that the session is being recorded and will be available online after, I think, on a YouTube channel, etc. So without further ado, I will introduce today's crew, who I am happy to say all have positions at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So go Flames. I am Elena Rebeca Gutiérrez. I'm an associate professor in gender and women's studies and Latin American and Latino studies. I'm also a member of the faculty board of U of I Press. I am a medium skin tone Latina with wavy shoulder length hair, and I'm wearing a blue polka dot blouse and cardigan sweater. Zizi Papakarizi is professor and head of the Department of Communication, a professor of political science, and university scholar at the University of Illinois system. Her work focuses on the social and political consequences of online media. Nadine Neber is a professor in the Gender and Women's Studies program and the Global Asian Studies program. And she's also affiliated with the Department of Anthropology. Her research interests lie at the intersections of transnational feminisms, women of color and queer of color theory, decolonizing feminisms, empire studies, critical race studies, and Middle East and Arab American studies. Robert Johnston is professor of history and director of the Teaching of History program. His work focuses on class, democracy, and populism in American history. Welcome, you all. Thank you for being here. Starting with Zizi, and then I guess going for Robert to Nadine, I'd like to ask you all to please tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your scholarship, and about the writing that you've done and that you currently do, especially sharing with us about those forums that you've published in outside of the Academy.
Thank you for that introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be in such good company. I think there's so many similarities and so much currency in the areas that my co-panelists study. It's such a pleasure to be in the position to have this conversation with them and with you all. I suppose, you know, in talking about the work that I do, I might broadly say that I study technology, democracy, society. My training is in the social sciences. So I was trained to do empirical work, and then as I grew into my own scholar, I learned and I got into a habit of, you know, throwing a heavy dose of the humanities into my work to aid my interpretations and provide and enhance sociocultural and historical context. My path has not been traditional, but I don't think that the path of either of my co-panelists has been traditional either. And that's because I started studying a very weird medium 25 years ago, the internet, and not very many outlets were interested in publishing work in that area. At the time I started studying the internet, less than 5% used it in the United States, about 1% used it globally. I often interviewed, and I was frequently asked if this thing is going to amount to anything, and I would say, well, you know, just give it some time, and it's going to be as ubiquitous as electricity is. It's going to be like, you know, entering a room and turning the lights on in our house, and people would laugh. I would be asked whether newspapers would eventually die, and I would say, well, not news, but paper's not going to be around for much longer. And again, that would be met with very just sort of kind and generous smiles. And then, of course, my favorite is because at the time I was studying for my doctoral degree at UT Austin, a very techie town, and be asked about Amazon in the late 90s, and with, you know, the preface of, you know, obviously Amazon doesn't have much of a future. And I'd say, perhaps now, but I mean, all they need is really very solid distribution centers. And of course, look at what's happening now. And it's not that I have any particular, you know, a secret crystal ball hiding underneath my desk, but it's because through studying the history of technology and also the sociocultural context in which technology develops, you know, we're able to make these educated guesses. It's been difficult to get my work published. I've had to target specific publishers. It's been also complicated to publicize it. I remember, I'll just start by saying that when I wrote my first monograph, my advisor said it might be a good time to try to write an editorial in the New York Times. My book concerned how technologies can reinvent democracies. It was published right after President Obama was elected. It started with a photograph that I took of the night that President Obama was elected and the celebrations in Grant Park. And I'd taken a picture of everybody raising their phones to capture the moment that the president walked on stage, because I thought it was so ironic that, you know, at the time that practice was not sort of an everyday thing. And I thought it was so ironic that people were more invested in capturing the moment rather than enjoying it. I'll wrap it up so that my co-panelists have time to speak, to say that I usually tend to turn to social media to publicize my work. I've benefited a lot from Twitter in terms of both getting inspiration from my work and also sharing thoughts, publicizing my work, publicizing things that I say. And also often if I have some ideas and I want to see if they have any theoretical legs or gravitas, I'll just throw them out onto the Twitterverse. And then the second thing I'll say is that what I enjoy even more than doing pursuing alternate forms of writing is rather engaging in conversations with networks of scholars that result in the publication of, a conversation among a group of people, or something that I've really enjoyed doing lately and I find allows me to reach a broad audience is working with folks who do podcasts.
All right, well, thank you. Greetings, and thank you, everyone, especially the press and the Institute for the Humanities for arranging this. I will just follow what Zizi said by adding that when I was in graduate school, these kinds of issues did not come up whatsoever. And a great majority of my comrades in graduate school were certainly very interested and very active in the public world. But in terms of thinking of how to connect that the scholarly work that we were engaged in and learning about to the public world, that was something that our professors never encouraged us to do. And so it's been a very welcome sea change to see that, at least in some limited and sometimes problematic ways, there are liberating new openings for public work. My own scholarship, as earlier indicated, is broadly on issues related to class, populism, and democracy. And I've published in those areas in traditional ways. And then also in terms of beyond the monograph, I wrote a middle school US history textbook. I actually have taken over a legacy college level textbook. But those are the kinds of things that are adjacent to traditional scholarship. They're certainly not that unusual. But especially as I've developed a project I've been working on, and as the pandemic has made that project much more salient, I've become more publicly involved. And so I'm still learning about this, but also finding quite thrilling, even though the subject matter is at times very deeply troubling. And that is, I'm working about a book about the histories of controversies over vaccines throughout American history, going back 300 years. And so there are some very unpretty stories in the past as well as in the present, as well as some actually promising ones of hope. And so I've been doing some work in podcasting, interviews and the like. So those kinds of standard things, but really not in any way that I can speak with any wisdom about, I would say, so far. And where I do, however, want to perhaps distinctively inflect this conversation is by saying that although our focus in the charge that we had for this session was about writing and legitimately, how do we go beyond the monograph? I was intrigued by one of the sentences in what we were asked to think about, and that is, how do other forms of communication amplify academic work, connecting it to new audiences? And in that way, what I've been involved in the most actually doesn't involve writing primarily. It's about teaching. And I've been very involved for a number of years working with K through 12 teachers to bring the same kind of issues and the same kind of scholarly concerns into the public realm in that way. And I look forward to maybe saying a few things about that later.
All right, should I jump in, Elena?
Yes, please.
All right, well, I'm Nadine, and before I entered academia, I was an activist working in anti-imperialist Arab and Arab American feminist movements, and also connecting that with women and queer of color feminist movements. So as an activist coming from an Arab diaspora community, we understood back then, this was early 90s, that central to our struggle for liberation, whether it was around Palestine or ending the US war on Iraq, that we were involved in a battle over narratives. So this was before academia, just recognizing that because of the long history of the US's portrayals of Arabs as potential terrorists or enemies of the United States, or that if we criticized Israel, we would be marked as anti-Semitic or supporters of terrorism, we understood that if we wanted to challenge state power, we were going to have to unseat the narratives about us. So this was always part of the activist work that I was involved in. And so it kind of, as you can imagine, seamlessly or organically continued into my academic work. So that was already at the core of what I did. And so, so this idea of like political work entails integrating counter narratives into our society in media, TV, radio, and now social media. So even, if it was writing for social movements, it was really important for activists to come together and not only make demands, but also create theoretical frameworks and analytical frameworks. And that's very much part of feminism of color, is around people who are targeted by whatever political issues at hand, are also theorists and analysts on their own terms. So that was kind of like the formation, I guess, that I came out of. So some examples of that would be writing, and also my academic work on anti-Arab racism, putting out, because a lot of folks, especially before September 11th, didn't, we would get attacked for even calling it anti-Arab racism. People would say Arabs are white, or there's no such thing as anti-Arab racism. This is just politics. So we had to actually insert, sort of like definitions of what is anti-Arab racism. Well, it's imperialist racism, and this is how it operates. Or working with anti-violence movements around gender violence, for women and queer people of color, we had to insert an analysis that state violence is a form of gender violence. So I guess that kind of skill of, giving, political struggles a name, and then, explaining them in ways that are accessible to all kinds of people was something that I really cared a lot about all along. And my scholarship is always, the purpose of my scholarship is to further social movements. So I am committed to like social movement-led research and theorizing. So that kind of leads me till today, where I ended up now writing a lot of op-eds. I was writing for the Chicago Reporter. It keeps ending, then I keep doing it again. And so I was a columnist this past year for the Chicago Reporter, and that really allowed me to connect my activist work, my academic work. So one of the areas is working on the activists of mothers in Chicago who are impacted by state violence. And so the op-eds might cover things like abolishing or radical mothering is essential to prison abolition. So kind of like these little phrases, I guess you could say, or including Arab Americans in the Biden administration is not enough, or Palestine is a feminist issue. So it kind of just allows you to, take that analytical work that, we might all do collectively in some spaces, and then just kind of put it out into the world to give other people a framework for thinking about some of these topics where we don't have a lot of opportunities to, capture them in these frameworks. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine, and everyone. I think you've all mentioned a variety of different forms that you've lifted voice in. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit more specifically about the impact that those, I don't even want to call them publications anymore, because it's not just written, right? It's also oral in the form of the podcast or teaching. But what kind of impact has that work had on communities outside of the academy? Nadine, do you want to start?
Okay, sure. I can be brief and just say that I think it has two kinds of impacts. One is it just gives people language so that they can also do work around issues they care a lot about, but might not have the framework. And I'm not saying I created the frameworks, it's all collective work, right? But that collective work I think is really important. So I think it can go a really long way. If you look at a movement like Insight that I was part of that, you know, Elena also does work and has done so much work in similar areas. Just giving a language for, like we said, or Elena's work, I guess, like reproductive injustice as a, or sorry, I'm losing track of where I'm going with it, but just giving frameworks so that other people can then continue to grow the work. And then the second one I would say, and this is really close to my heart, is sometimes this kind of work allows people to see themselves in the work in ways they might not have ever seen themselves represented before. So for me, some of the most profound impacts of writing for the public is when, let's say, younger Arab women or queer Arab activists say, you know, I read this piece and I've never seen myself represented in anything I've ever read before. And then that allows them to uplift who they are and grow their own sense of like radical self-love and collective love. And it might lead to major transformations in their own life in terms of like how they might engage with their conflictual relationship with their family, or maybe it will lead them to then reach out and find other Arab feminist activists and recognize that that might be a space where they could find a sense of home or belonging that they never had before. So to me, those are some of the most powerful impacts.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Nadine. Zizi, would you like to comment next?
Sure. You know, I mean, I'd have to say that there's no model that fits all types of scholarships or research areas, and can't really say that all avenues are going to generate the same kind of impact. So there might be some things that might be friendlier to the goals that, you know, Nadine's work is seeking to accomplish. There's other avenues that may be friendlier to different research goals. I have a lot of colleagues. I think, you know, writing op-eds is a fantastic route, and it's a very direct way of communicating to a variety of diverse publics and advocating for an issue. And it's something that should be respected and applauded, because it requires a great deal of dedication and really retraining your brain to speak in a language that's quite different than the language of the monograph. And also just being able to write very, very quickly on the fly and cultivating those kinds of relationships that allow you to get the work there very, very quickly in a timely fashion. And in addition, and I think that kind of work can be very impactful in setting the agenda, and also, as Nadine said, providing people with a language, changing the discourse, you know, bringing in new vocabulary. I would also add to those things that what I find meaningful in my area of work is cultivating connections to companies that are involved in designing these platforms, that are involved in designing these technologies, and making sure that, you know, they're consulting enough, that their computer scientists have social scientists that they can consult with, that help them understand, you know, what it means when they design a video game that depicts a woman in a very stereotypical fashion, or that depicts humans, generally speaking, in ways that reproduce and reinforce unhealthy stereotypes about race, class, gender, race, ethnicity, what have you. So I see that as being a very meaningful way to make a difference and to have an impact. And of course, you know, you have to understand that this all happens in very, very slow steps, and that change is very, very gradual, although there has been change. I think another way to think about it is writing a different kind of monograph. So, you know, beyond the monograph could involve writing a book that appeals to a broad audience, that's written in a different language. That's something that I tried to do with my book After Democracy, where I traveled the world and spoke to strangers, and I wrote it in a way that's just sort of try to break away from academic language and be kind of like, you know, like treated like I'm telling someone a bedtime story about democracy and how it might reinvent itself in the future. I would also say that once you get the monograph out, and then, you know, once you get to a point of recognition, I feel it's our duty to the academic world and to other scholars to cultivate new spaces of creativity, of freedom, to bend the rules a little bit, to provide different pathways and avenues for them to publish work that may be new, that may be different, that had been overlooked in the past. So I really enjoy pulling together networks of scholars, either for colloquia or symposia, or to have conversations with, or in edited volumes, or I founded and I run a journal called Social Media and Society. It is open access. And I think that's very useful because it makes academic work available to a very broad audience. And I also use it to encourage a variety of different types of work, including short essays. We have a section called 2K, that just means 2,000 words. And that's another way where we've seen some impact in communicating the work that we do to broader.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, look, the issue of influence and how much this all has an effect is arguably impossible to tell. It's certainly in one of my main realms, the teaching of history. I'm determined to think that the most democratic and liberating kinds of passing on of historical wisdom and thinking are indeed completely unquantifiable. They're only accessible through different modes of interpretive humanistic inquiry. So all that said, I really appreciate, especially, everything that Nadine and Zizi said, but especially at the end, Zizi, what you said about one of our influences that might be just as important as that for the broader public is among our colleagues, to show that there are different ways in which we can be scholars and intellectuals and academics. And we might pick up on that more later. In terms of the work I do with teachers or in schools more generally, I find one pretty clear sense of the influence that we can have there is that teachers are thirsting to be seen as complete, not just human beings, which they're unfortunately not viewed as far too often, but as scholars and intellectuals themselves. And I think they are very much, whether they engage in research or not. And of course, most do not. And so when I'm doing professional development workshops, whether it's in Chicago Public Schools or the Newberry Library, regardless of the subject matter that we really wrestle with, that's almost always the first kind of comment that the teachers will make on evaluations, is that they feel like they are now part of that conversation in a way that they know that they're qualified for, but their job is often defined in a way that doesn't allow them to do that. And that goes even deeper into students. I have not spoken for a long time to middle or elementary schools, but I do relatively regularly to high school students. And there the same kind of thing happens, which is that students catch fire knowing that in fact they can have the same kind of dialogue, the same kind of arguments, often very impassioned arguments, that scholars do as well, that that's really the soul of history as well as more broadly humanistic debate.
Thank you all very much for that. So we just talked about all the, the possibilities. How about sharing some of the challenges or more difficult aspects of doing this kind of work? Robert, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure.
Thank
you.
I
got a story for that. That's very direct and related to the University of Illinois. So in my field, as in many humanistic fields, the gold standard for promotion to full professor is 2 monographs. And I had a wonderful chair, possibly she's here, Laura Hostetler, who said, let's look at the broad range of your scholarly and academic and public work and see if perhaps a different profile might work for a promotion to full professor. This is back in 2014. And there were lots of people who thought like, no, you must have that second monograph. There's no way you could do it. And Laura said, if you're willing to fail, then let's give it a try. And we did. And then my department was unanimous in its support, but then things went wrong further up the ladder. At the LAS vote and the campus P&T vote, I got voted down. And then actually it was, and I usually don't like administrators meddling in faculty affairs, but in this case it worked out okay. The provost overturned that decision. I'm thinking, recognizing that in fact, that especially at a public institution like UIC, we do want to begin to substantively honor that broad range of work. But still, that's a struggle. I know within our own department, there are discussions and disputes more broadly in our university, as well as, of course, throughout the country and the world in these matters. But I think maybe we're making some limited progress.
Can I just jump in real quick and ask if you have tips for folks who would like to follow in your footsteps? I mean, you generously really offered your own experience, and so as follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, it maybe sounds like too much of a liberal romantic bromide here, but I will say that, look, if there's a reason you wanted to go into academia and you have genuinely the honor and the privilege, increasingly the privilege of being in a position where you even can think of having a tenure track position and the like, is avoid fear, do what you think is best. As Nadine said, speak to the highest purposes that you came in with and kind of see how things work out. And generally I've seen, not just for myself, but in other cases, that people who have been as brave as possible, not saying that I was brave, but in other cases, it's worked out well. Sometimes it's been disastrous though, and you take real risks.
Thank you. Those are exciting things to hear. So thank you for the ánimo or the advice. Zizi, would you like to chime in here?
Sure. You asked about the biggest challenges. I would say the first one is rejection. You know, you spend a lot of time writing something for Slate or The Atlantic or New York Times or wherever you want to send it. And sometimes you've even been invited to write something and you set everything aside, you focus up, you send it in, and for some reason it's not taken in. So it just really seems to be like a big waste of your time. But in those cases, you know, generally a good practice is to just have a backup outlet. And thankfully, there are many platforms that offer that. Medium is one. There's a variety of different conversational platforms. Jezebel, there's a number of different outlets that can be used. And then, of course, you can use your own Twitter account to promote your work and the insights that you shared. And of course, a lot of the journals, especially in our field, have these shorter essay sections that are particularly useful for hosting and encouraging these kinds of conversations. But then challenge number two is really just, you know, going through a period where you have to tell yourself that I'm going to be a public scholar. I'm going to have to figure out a way to speak to broader audiences in a relatable way. And someone might think, you know, well, that can't be that much of a challenge. We do that every day because we're teaching. But that's sort of a guaranteed audience, you know, when you try to be a public-minded, public-facing scholar, you most of the time you're trying to get the attention of people who have better things to do, not really interested, you know, don't really have the time to listen to you and are wondering why they should listen to you to begin with. So you really slowly have to get into the habit of telling stories, relating, framing things in useful ways, teaching yourself to speak to people who think in ways that are very, very different from how you think or how your friends think. And really, you know, I mean, it goes back to what Einstein and so many said, like, if, you know, you can't explain something simply, then you haven't understood it well enough. I think it's a deeply gratifying experience. You know, you learn to speak on your feet. You know, there's nothing that you really can't comment on. But it takes a lot of work and practice, or at least it does for me, you know, to do that.
Nadine, you have anything to add?
Sure. This is a big topic, a really important topic. Well, I think one of the things that, you know, also was somewhat built on what Robert was talking about is around how, and I think especially I think of junior scholars, scholars of color, scholars doing interdisciplinary work, and this especially plays out with scholars who are doing public scholarship. There is the gatekeeping, right? Academic oppression that demands that, conventional forms of scholarship, and all of this, academic industrial complex oppression leads many folks who want to do this work to question the very worth of their ideas, of their scholarship, by internalizing the gatekeeping, the scrutiny, the evaluations. It can really create a lot of anxiety. I'm just saying this to be real, right? And it can really lead folks to get stuck in worrying about what others, which usually means gatekeepers, will think about what they write. And how can we be creative, right, if we're trapped in questioning what others will think about what we write. And I've done actually some research on this, and every single person across the board uses words like, I'm living in misery, I'm in despair, it feels like torture. Sorry, I need to turn that off. And so I just want to really just say that out loud, especially, to other folks who might be listening and might experience some of these anxieties, and just propose maybe how important it is to ground ourselves and actually put the work in around grounding and regrounding ourselves in what we believe in, what we stand for, and our vision of the university as a site for social change, for social transformation, even while that sometimes can bump up against the increasing corporatization of the university, and claiming and defending the university spaces that, can continue to provide for this kind of work. We all know about imposter syndrome and, all of these syndromes that we don't talk enough about. And so I think, one piece I like to always suggest is, I was talking about like regrounding practices and putting the work into just noticing, like, how are you showing up? Like, how do we show up to the university? Are we giving our power away? Are we internalizing that, our work is less than? Are we, are we trapped in these, habitual thoughts about, not being enough? And if, if that's the case, I think there are also things that we can do. We can take responsibility for how we're responding to this pressure, finding communities of like-minded folks. And also one suggestion that I have just when it comes to writing is, what I would like to say is like writing for ourselves first. So sometimes we all writing for others, and then you start thinking of the grant maker or the journal editors, but to write for ourselves, whether it's a research project, like, what do you believe in about this project? Why are you doing it? And it doesn't have to be an argument or an academic paper. So I think writing for ourselves first and just writing out what you believe in relation to the project. And then another one, which is, maybe funny, but it's about giving names to what we do. I think, making names up to name our approaches and our interventions. So for example, if you're struggling to move your project forward or move an alternative, publicly engaged project forward, give it a name of your own. And then, so for example, in my book, I use the word diasporic Arab feminist critique, or another group of scholars has used Indigenous Pacific Islander cultural studies when they found that there were no other theoretical frameworks that were useful for what they were trying to do. And so sometimes I think it's about naming what we're doing on our own terms, naming our approaches. And it's like the politics of naming is incredibly powerful because it can uplift, this sense that like, we're not enough, or we don't have anything to say, or I'm an imposter. it allows us to, in a way, take our power back, and then to be able to write out, why do I use this approach? What is this approach or this idea that's so essential to my work? So I think it's, again, goes back to what we talked about earlier, are these just naming and claiming our analyses, our analytical toolkits, and then being able to explain why this approach or this idea that I have is the most viable one in order to be able to do this project or analyze this material or, create the social transformation I'm trying to create. So for me, that's been a really important way of taking our power back and regrounding myself and ourselves in why I'm here in the first place. So I just wanted to pass that along, especially to junior folks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for naming all of that for us and giving us such inspiration in the end. So in the spirit of Nadine's final comments, Zizi and Robert, do you have any advice or tips that you'd like to offer others who are interested in writing beyond academic expectations?
I can start, if that's okay. I would say you don't have to do this on your own. So find mentors and cultivate a network of support. Being an academic can get kind of lonely, so it doesn't have to be that way. Look for allies. Talk to people who have done this. And that's the second thing, find people that you admire, whose work you admire, whose practice of being a public-facing academic you respect, and try to not necessarily imitate them, but learn from their style, learn from what they do and use it to develop your own academic persona. And finally, I would say what somebody said to me when I was writing my first monograph, always write no matter who you're writing for, write like you're sitting down with someone and you're having a coffee or a tea or something, and you're telling them a story, because I think that's what keeps you fun. It keeps it fun and keeps you from, helps you forget the anxiety and keeps you from thinking about imposter syndrome and all of those things. Because ultimately, it has to be about enjoying ourselves, about finding that balance between what we do and then the things that we try to change.
Thank you, Zizi.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback off kind of that last comment, perhaps saying the same thing, which is that your public-facing work can only contribute and make better to your more traditional scholarly work, especially if we want to have a broader range of robust ideas in play within academe. There's no better way than to learn to actually to communicate well, and that's what this kind of work is very crucial to help doing.
Well said, Robert. Thank you so much. Okay, with that, we have a few minutes left. If there are any questions from the audience. I'm not seeing anything yet. You can also put it in the chat. I have one question. From Ishani Mukherjee, for early career scholars, researchers, especially POCs / BIPOC, etc., venturing into monograph publishing, how much institutional / university support is important or even realistic to expect in terms of getting opportunities to talk about their diverse research and or learning about publication strategies in their field of study that would give them visibility, quote unquote?
But there's silence. I don't. I'm gonna venture a little bit at a time, I guess, and kind of trust your gut and try to observe a healthy balance between trusting your gut and also making sure that you don't overpromise your time. You don't overpromise beyond your ability, beyond what you can do, because again, those things will lead to anxiety. I mean, I think we all got into academia to avoid the anxieties of other professions, and because we wanted to give to give back, to contribute back to the world that inspired us in some way. So I would say just, take it one step at a time, plan well, and just try to make strategic choices about how you want to start being visible, where, and then how you might scale that out.
Nadine or Robert? Nadine?
Oh, I was going to say, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have an awful lot more to add besides what Zizi said, except that I would again echo what Nadine was talking about earlier, which is that I'm sorry, I think it was Nadine, but yeah, you find mentors and you find alliances and you create them and craft them both within your department, within your university, and then outside that. And the more you realize that they're very powerful forces that are supporting your work, even if at the same time they're very powerful forces resisting that, then that will provide you with a major way of both creating visibility, right, which is in itself an important goal, and making your work better, and being able to thrive in doing the kind of work that you really want to do.
Thank you, everyone. I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh, we have one more question just popped up, and this will probably be our last question. Can you talk about funding opportunities beyond the NEH that you have sought and or obtained to provide release time for researching and writing?
Well, I'll just say things that I've heard of. I don't know if they're viable or relevant or, so there's Russell Sage Foundation, there's Open Societies Foundation, there's what else? ACLS. We could just list all the ones we know of. Isn't there a American Women in the Academy one, something like that? Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, of course. And I would add the McCormick and MacArthur Foundations just here in the area for people who are interested in doing work in the media representation. They have a very specific a component that deals with literacy and educating the public. So your work must be public facing. And they usually connect you with outlets that can then publicize and publish your work.
Should we mention some of the offices at UIC where folks can go to learn, get some support on researching grant opportunities? Where the office,
so the office of, go ahead.
No, you please go ahead.
I was just going to say the Office of Social Science and Research for us, and then the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, and everybody please chime in.
Corporate and foundation relations as well.
Absolutely, they're wonderful.
Well, I think that's a pretty good list. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for the questions too, because I really think they take us back to what the reality is and how much of a struggle it is to just even get any kind of feeling of institutional support or the time to be able to do that additional labor. So thank you, Ashani and Ben, for chiming in there. And with that, I'm going to have to thank our panelists once again for sharing their knowledge and their expertise with us. It certainly is very, inspiring to know the impact that your work has had both inside and outside of the academy. And I appreciate you for being scholars who are interested in showing up to panels like this, right? Another kind of public, and helping us, other scholars find their way to what Robert called those liberating new openings. So I'm going to end the panel with just wishing us all many new liberating new openings for all of us. And thanks once again to the University of Illinois Press and the Institute for Humanities and OVCR for offering this panel. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you. Pleasure.